My name is Ahmad Jawad, Director of the Center for Indo-Lanka Initiatives at Pathfinder Foundation. I'll be your moderator for this session. As was announced, the subject or theme of this session is Indo-Pacific strategy and its implications for the Indian Ocean community. In terms of logistics, we have a presenter, Kim Dara, who will present his paper for 30 minutes. We have 3 distinguished panelists, and then we will go into a discussion stage of about 20 minutes, more or less. The current Indo-Pacific strategy has been in IR discourse for over a decade, more specifically since around 2008. But of course, as has been mentioned this morning, the term itself had been used in the early part of the 20th century in Europe, but in a very restricted sense. Yet for all its importance, the knowledge of what the Indo-Pacific concept is and what is all about is still in a very restricted knowledge base. This is more so as we get to the Indian Ocean states, even though the concept is going to affect us in very significant degree as we go along. Today, therefore, there is a need to understand what the term means, what the free and open Indo-Pacific means, because that is again subject to various interpretations among those who have agreed on the term, what its various implications are for a number of reasons. Sri Lanka, among these small states, has a great deal to do on the learning curve. I'm sure the other states like us have a similar experience to gain. What are these reasons? What are the challenges? What are its implications? Hopefully, we'll have some answers at the end of this session. To do justice to this theme, we have with us this morning Mr. King Harriet Dara. He joined the Perth US Asia Center as Research and Program Fellow for South Asia, following a 14-year career in defense. He served with the Australian government in Timor-Leste, Afghanistan, and most recently in India from 2019 to 2023. In 2021, he was the first Australian civilian to complete India's year-long National Defense College course. The floor is yours, Mr.
Thank you. Hopefully everyone can hear. Well, thank you so much for the warm welcome, sir. And I'd really like to welcome and acknowledge all the participants here, including excellencies and representatives of the diplomatic community, but also the Sri Lankan Navy, and also plenty of former friends and colleagues from India and all around the world. I'd like to particularly thank the Pathfinder Foundation, not just for hosting this conference on a really important topic, but also just for the extraordinary hospitality that's been shown to us as the speakers as we've been here. It's really warmly appreciated. Now, for my session, I didn't want to talk about the big picture maritime strategic issues as we typically do, because I'm interested in honing in on a concept that gets often raised in the context of maritime strategy: freedom of navigation. Now here, in case this is a relief to any of the attendees, I'm not going to be talking about who claims what maritime boundaries, where EEZs exist, how we resolve maritime boundary disputes. I think that's a conversation best left to people more qualified in another session. But I am talking about the principles that we all agree on for what are the rules of the road for when we have vessels entering various maritime zones around the world. How do we show respect for coastal states while preserving our own rights of freedom of navigation when traveling through those waters? We've already heard mention of the concept in the context of the Red Sea, freedom of navigation is one of the most often cited principles when it comes to disputes in the South China Sea. And of course, you hear it all the time in government statements. My own government is a strong proponent of freedom of navigation. We talk about it often. It's in our diplomatic statements and our joint statements with Quad partners, with all sorts of bilateral relationships. So it clearly matters. And I'm not sure that there are many countries around the world that need convincing of the importance of the concept to protect civilian merchant shipping. And for the economy, we only need to look at the Red Sea for examples of why that matters. But within the Indo-Pacific, there is divergence in interpretations of the concept when it relates to what militaries should be permitted to do, what we should expect from a naval ship or a military aircraft when they're near another country's coastline. And in that respect, the US's stance differs from India's, which differs from ours, which differs from Malaysia. And there are any number of minor divergences throughout the region on exactly how we should respect this principle. I think that's a divergence that's pretty familiar to a lot of people in this room, but I'm not sure it's as understood as widely as it could be elsewhere, and I think that perhaps needs to change over time. I should mention fundamentally, nothing in what I'm about to address here suggests that divergence is a cause for any kind of alarm. Thank you. None of it's a cause. Awesome, thank you so much. Fundamentally, I don't think the system of international law or international relations requires us to have every state agree on every principle in every respect. What it does try to do is serve a higher function, which is encourage states to have productive and stable relationships and ensure that they're able to manage disputes constructively and find ways through them. So how disputes are resolved is at least as important as what the resolution itself is. So essentially what I'm saying is the divergences we're talking about aren't a cause for alarm so long as no one's forcing their preferred norms on anyone else. And most countries aren't doing that. But I still think it's important for policymakers, including in Australia, to be sensitive about those divergences, because I speculate that as the Indo-Pacific region becomes even more focused on the maritime domain, and as the waters of the region become more congested and more contested, we might find those differences manifest in unpredictable ways, and we should be ready for it. So as I've mentioned, I don't think it's a surprise to a lot of the experts in this room that there are divergences. My loose way of explaining this as a non-lawyer is to essentially explain that Australia's position and that of many countries in the world, including the US, is to see, for example, an exclusive economic zone as a zone in which the coastal state has sovereign rights and those rights need to be respected. But it doesn't have jurisdiction in the sense that the EEZ is an extension of that country's territory. So from our perspective, when our Navy sails through an EEZ, we consider it to have the same rights to operate as it normally would anywhere else on the high seas. China obviously has a very different approach to that, and it would seek to have more expansive rights over its EEZs. And we'd like to have more of a say over which countries do what, in what mode, and in what circumstances when they enter its maritime zones. And of course, you have other countries that don't seek to promote those rights, but they do have concerns when a foreign military enters an EEZ, for example, and wants to conduct a military exercise. And then you have other niche requirements. Malaysia, for example, has some restrictions on whether vessels are carrying nuclear materials through its EEZ. So a lot of divergence. And I think what's important in the context of this talk, and again, as a lot of the audience members would know, consistency is really important when these claims are being promoted. If you claim that a foreign vessel shouldn't enter your EEZ without permission, then you really undermine your own claim if you enter another state's EEZ without permission. If you're enforcing rules on one country, but you're making an exception for another, that potentially dilutes your position from a legal and a policy standpoint. And likewise, consistency matters in another way. You can make a theoretical claim, or a claim in legislation, but if you're not constantly articulating it, and if you're not speaking up if a foreign vessel enters your water, potentially questions can be raised about how defensible your position is. There are plenty more examples than those that I've listed on the slides of where divergencies lie when it relates to military freedom of navigation. And I think there's probably a range of claims from those that are, I think, frankly, easily dismissed, but some where there are legitimate differences of viewpoints. And again, I've got to emphasise, divergence isn't a cause for concern as long as no one's coercing anyone. But I think if you asked a lot of journalists or even many government officials about the subject, I suspect that a lot of them might be surprised at the extent of the difference in the region. I think that's interesting because for most of these cases, none of these claims emerged overnight. Malaysia didn't make a claim about its EEZ and foreign vessels carrying nuclear materials in the last week or two. A lot of these claims were made when countries acceded to UNCLOS. It's interesting that that hasn't been, the awareness of that fact hasn't been as widely understood as I think it should be. I think the explanation for that is kind of twofold. The first is a lot of people weren't paying as close attention to this as they were, or as they are now, because they didn't have a reason to track differences until disputes such as those in the South China Sea really boiled up and some of these issues started to come to the fore. So a lot of commentators probably associate disagreements over freedom of navigation with disputes between the US and China or disputes in those Asian sort of disputed waters. I think there could also be another element to it, and this is speculative. But I think it's possible that while a lot of Indo-Pacific states were articulating these restrictions on freedom of navigation before, they haven't had the chance to prioritise those restrictions. And I think, to be frank, that's because they've had more important priorities to worry about. So if we think about the strategic circumstances in the region arbitrarily, let's say 20 years ago, I'm making very sweeping generalisations about this, but a lot of states were really rightly focused on very much higher priorities. Those included tackling poverty, those included very real security challenges, territorial disputes on land borders, insurgencies, terrorism. When it came to security forces, for a lot of states, not necessarily all, but for a lot of states, it was armies rather than navies and coast guards that really took the bulk of the numbers, the funding, the capabilities, and even at times the political influence. The oceans always mattered to the region, but they weren't as contested and they weren't as crowded as they were before, as they are now, sorry. And then when you think about maritime disputes in places like the South China Sea, those were always dangerous and they led to huge losses in conflict in the past. But we also had a period of rough equilibrium or a status quo for quite some time where the risk of escalation into great power conflict just wasn't as present as it is to us now. So I think in that broad context, I'm really not sure how many regional leaders would have had the luxury of focusing on niche and, to be honest, arcane kind of aspects and complicated aspects of disputes over these parts of international law. I think things have changed. The region's waters, as I said, they're crowded, they're contested. Sustained development matters to everyone, and that requires judicious use of resources, real efforts to protect and preserve the maritime environment. And it means that I think more countries than ever before are paying close attention to the region's waters. That also means there are more Coast Guard and Navy vessels in the water than there ever have been before. And it means everyone's really watching naval competition between the US and China very closely. Unsurprisingly, and I'm sure this will be discussed in our sessions later, you're also seeing the corresponding increase in investments in maritime domain awareness, information sharing and naval capabilities. And I think one other thing is happening that's interesting, and again, this is a very subjective and speculative point that I'd welcome thoughts on later when we discuss, but I think the US has been running this freedom of navigation operations program in which the objective is to sail through waters to underscore its right to do so and to underscore the fact that it's doing so as part of its obligations and rights under international law. I think it had a fairly narrow purpose in that respect for the most part. But I think increasingly people associate that program with disputes, and they associate it with the US's broader competition with countries, including with China. And so I think people are reading into that program symbolism that perhaps wasn't as strong, let's say, 10 years ago. To me, all of that translates into a real perspective shift in the region. The maritime domain always mattered, but I think more people are aware of it now. And it follows that maritime norms, which may have been more of a theoretical concern in the past, are now becoming very real as the oceans are becoming fuller, and vessels are now encountering each other much more often. And as contests for resources really matter, so too does your ability to exert your legal claims to support your interests. And I think conversations on freedom of navigation are becoming a much less of a niche subject that were confined to expert circles. I think they're getting more attention from generalists, as I'd call them. And I saw that process in my own government when I was an official there. You saw, you had Australia, which had always been a maritime focused country and always had a real depth of expertise in these issues. But often that expertise was siloed among those who were working directly on the issues. I think now it's much more common to see officials engaging much more broadly in some of these issues because they have such a real and present effect on us, not just when we think about maritime disputes, but also when we look at maritime issues more broadly and as we try to enhance our cooperation with lots of our partners. So, where does this lead? I think that there's an increased incentive, and the incentive will grow over the coming decades, for consistency in countries' claims. And what I mean by that is, firstly, aligning claims with behaviour, but it could also take lots of other sort of manifestations. We could see that as the years progress, some states might seek more consistency by reconciling their positions on the subject with those of the broader international community, with countries like the US. But I also think, likewise, we should be open to the possibility that others might seek to double down on their positions. They might be aware that more countries are watching Indo-Pacific waters, aware that if they're not consistently defending their positions, that other countries will take notice and it will weaken their position. And I think that potentially, I welcome comments from Indian colleagues now, but or at the end of the presentation, but I speculate that for countries like India, which is really concerned by China's growing naval power, this kind of doubling down might be really appealing because essentially there's real concern about growing Chinese influence further into the Indian Ocean, and India may well want to preserve the ability to dictate the military activities that it seeks to allow or disallow in its own EEZ. I think there's one other implication that I should have included on the slide, and that is this comment that I make where more people are engaged in these issues than before, where it used to be the domain of experts. I think there was a really instructive example in 2021 when the US conducted a freedom of navigation operation in India's EEZ. And here I'm not making a comment on whether or not the operation itself should have happened, but the public reaction was really revealing because it demonstrated that if you're a well-educated journalist or you're a think tanker who understands and follows the international developments but may not have a background in following very technical debates on freedom of navigation, leaving aside legitimate disagreements about what freedom of navigation is, a lot of journalists would see that operation, interpret it intuitively. They won't necessarily see a great distinction between an EEZ or a country's territory, and all they'll see is a highly visible and potentially provocative kind of incidents of a foreign navy coming close to India. And they found their own interpretations for that. A lot of commentators saw that as political messaging. They saw it as an attempt at intimidation. Now, that didn't necessarily reflect the Indian government view, but I think that broadening of the audience and the greater engagement in these issues really matters for us because it demonstrates that these issues the audience, if you're advocating for these issues, is no longer just a select group. You're actually trying to influence people who really have real sway in their countries about the direction that their country's foreign policy takes. And so that puts the onus on us to think about how accessible our messaging is on some of these issues and how empathetic we make the position. And I think that applies to the US and to Australia, but potentially to any country who's seeking to advocate norms that they prefer in these respects. So what do we do? My default is, I've worked in Australia so long, so my default is always to think about what Australia can do. But I suspect that some of these observations may have relevance for other countries more broadly. And the first thing is, if there are going to be changes in how freedom of navigation is defended, respected, defined, I think governments will be among the first to know it, because the first warning sign will be increased levels of radio challenges to vessels moving through certain areas. So if we're not keeping a close eye on changes to that and baselining statistics and understanding where trends lie, then I suspect we should be. I think we should also be paying real close attention to the formation of maritime security coordination bodies, which are often involved in not only aligning and gripping up interagency efforts in their country on maritime security, but also reconciling domestic legislation and organisational mandates. And I think those changes can be very revealing. There's a question for some of us where our countries are very often, as I mentioned, referring to freedom of navigation and using the term in joint statements with our partners. And I think that's an interesting approach given the extent of the divergences that exist. But I actually don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, so long as it's done with a clear-eyed sense of where divergencies lie and ensuring that there's no complacency when it comes to missing opportunities to constructively address the areas where we don't agree, privately or directly with a bilateral, in a bilateral context. I think we could also be thinking more about how there's increasing the broad awareness about how we should address the divergencies that exist. The next time a partner is more reluctant to conduct a military exercise that we used to do with them in an area that crosses multiple countries' EEZs, and perhaps they show more reluctance than normal, I think we should be open to the idea that perhaps their interpretation of freedom of navigation rights might be part of the explanation for why. Likewise, one of the greatest initiatives I think that the Australian government does is sponsor dialogues where specialists in law of the sea will engage in debates, training courses, and engagements broadly with their counterparts to discuss these issues. I think that's really valuable. And I wonder if there's also scope to expand those kinds of discussions to make them more accessible or find ways that are efficient, but that help sell the narrative that essentially they're trying to advocate. In a way that's more understandable beyond those bureaucratic contexts, because we can't treat this issue, if we think it's important, as a merely technocratic one confined to narrow circles. So yeah, I think it's important that regardless of a state's individual claims, of which there are many, they should still be making an effort to articulate those principles that they're upholding in a much more accessible way. And that applies to Australia, that applies to the US, but it potentially applies to all the Indian Ocean region states as well. I think finally I just wanted to note President Wickramasinghe's recommendation a couple of years ago. He made it in Australia, where he called for a code of conduct to be established where regional militaries made an agreement on what an acceptable set of behaviours were when they're moving through the Indian Ocean region. I think that call symbolises the spirit of constructive engagement, and I don't think that should be easily dismissed. I think that some states will be quite cautious about this if they fear that engaging in those discussions potentially reopens UNCLOS for negotiation, or potentially poses problems because you set precedents for a creeping closing of the maritime domain. I think those concerns are really valid. But I think given the context I've laid out, there's real value in also meaningfully taking up offers to discuss these issues to ensure that we do it constructively. And there may well be means for foreign militaries to make their activities more transparent and build more trust in the region without necessarily ceding the claims that they're looking to to advocate. I think it's interesting that the president himself, he made a comment that the Indian Ocean region is its own ocean. I think that symbolises the point I'm trying to make. It's important to engage this region in its own right because of its own significance, not just through the lens of great power competition. So I thought that was a really valuable contribution from him. But I'll leave it from here. I'm conscious that there's many more qualified people than me to discuss this issue, and they may have really excellent ideas that had not occurred to me. But thank you, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Dara. I think you have brought some very interesting ideas and also questions to the table. One thing that I recall very well here is in terms of the term free and open Indo-Pacific and how even Quad countries could differ in their interpretation. We will now move on to our panelists, our distinguished panelists. We have, as the first speaker, Ambassador HMGS Palyakara, who retired as Foreign Secretary of Sri Lanka after 37 years of civil and diplomatic service. His last diplomatic assignment abroad was as Sri Lanka's ambassador and permanent representative to the United Nations in New York. He was one-time chairman of the UN Secretary General's Advisory Board on Disarmament Matters. Ambassador Palyakara also served as Sri Lanka's permanent representative to the United Nations in Geneva and was ambassador to Thailand, in addition to being concurrently accredited as permanent representative to the Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. Ambassador Palyakara.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, my colleague and friend, Ambassador Jawad, and thank you, Ambassador Bernard Gunathilaka and your Pathfinder team for once again organizing this important and timely discourse. Speaking to as vast and complex item as the Indo-Pacific, by itself calls for serious political will, but to do so within 10 minutes, I now realize calls for serious surgical skills as well. So to your text and so forth. So please, you have to be rather forgiving for my random utterings. But I'll try to do so as a retiree in as frank a way as possible, without weighed down by heavy demands of diplomacy. The declared, I'll try to focus on not specific areas in which I have no specialty to share, but on broader, larger geopolitical, strategic force relations and how they interact with the states of the region in addressing the topic that we have. Of course, the declared core philosophy central to the IPS, Indo-Pacific strategy, or at least to its marketing dimension, which is open, free Indo-Pacific, in which rules-based order prevails, is naturally attractive to a good majority of countries in the region, both developed and developing, including Sri Lanka, of course. This is because these laudable and widely shared norms are supposed to promote and protect common security and democratic and sovereign agency of of the many, while hopefully also helping to create level playing situations. IPS also promotes quite useful sectoral work, some of which you will discuss in the course of this seminar, afternoon and tomorrow. Sectoral work in maritime security domain, cooperation in IU fishing, disasters, transnational threats, etc., etc. However, whether the core philosophy's objective and principles it espouses have been matched in state practice, whose and what rules one is talking about. As Ambassador Shiv Shankar Menon mentioned in the morning, in maybe broader and wiser words, absence of a internationally agreed order. How equitably free the freedom of navigation is, I think Mr. Zaraj made some very pertinent comments there. And how open are the powers that be in the IPS realm? How open are they for enlightened international cooperation as against zero-sum contestations? These are all questions that remain in the realm of controversy and debate. And Mr. Ara's good paper actually lists gives some how different countries differently see the simple enough notion of the freedom of navigation. I must say one could have actually added one more to that menu of complications that in fact a third country can undermine the freedom of navigation, even if the sending country and the receiving country agree on a given maritime activity. I mean, we in South Asia are quite familiar with that. So these are all complexities. So then I come to the next point. Any discussion of the IPS impact, whether you evaluate it in terms of the response from the countries of the region, or in terms of the interest of the IPS advocacy countries. So any discussion cannot go much far without reckoning with the elephant in the room, or more appropriately here, the eagle and the dragon in the room. That is the increasingly adversarial contestation between China and the United States, sometimes along with the US allies. In fact, the way in which the Indian Ocean states, the littorals in particular, perceive and respond to the IPS has become, I'm simplifying things too much, but has become a function of the success or failure of these countries to maintain an equilibrium in their relations with these two powers. So that is the extent of IPS footprint and this power contestation. There are many examples, but I don't think we have time to go through. But in case of Sri Lanka's recovery, I think about a week ago, the US Assistant Secretary of State, Mr. Donald Lu, was here. He described the good progress by Sri Lanka as the greatest comeback story of recent times. And he, I think, correctly said that under IPS auspices, the great friends of Sri Lanka like India, Japan, France, and the US, of course, the coordinated action to achieve that, to help Sri Lanka achieve that. And then he went on to directly, significantly add that it was the IPS coordination that persuaded China eventually to join the IMF pathway for recovery process. Of course, the China sees this differently and maintains that Sri Lanka's problem is not about a debt trap that is traceable to China, but more a development trap traceable to structural issues and other external meddling. But the China's relevance of IPS has remained clear and present from the beginning, and United States senior officials at different fora have been very clear that maintaining what they call the consequential relationship with China is the central element of IPS, and positioning I'm quoting his word, positioning the U.S. To outcompete China and maintain an enduring competitive edge is the primary focus. The translation of this heavy diplomacy into citizens' language is containing China. So, in the geo-economic and geostrategic domains. And this is, of course, quite evident in the ongoing policies and practices. Of course, on its part, China claims that its ascent, its rise, is peaceful. But of course, it has yet to reconcile this, what it calls a peaceful ascent, with its rather forceful presence in the region and beyond. That includes a significant build-up of military capacity in all areas and rather aggressive state behavior, especially in South China Sea and even in the Taiwan Straits. And add to that a quite compelling diplomacy, proactive diplomacy by China to do this power projection in the region and even beyond. Some call this wolf diplomacy, diplomacy and all that, but I don't want to go into that. But it's rather proactive and compelling diplomacy. So it was in this context that complex and wide-ranging responses elicited by the IPS from the states, countries in the region are being debated in academic and analytical realms and tested in practitioners' domains continually for the last several years now. So now coming more specifically, how did these responses look like? I see about 3-4 areas in which you can look at this. Firstly, naturally, those who reacted positively to work with the IPS as an alliance or a framework, partnership framework, supportive of their national interests. That is basically the US-led Western and Asian, you can call it alliance, partnership, whatever, who were concerned about the US's declining interest in the Pacific. That was during the Trump era, and rising China coupled with associated power rivalry. So that's one group. Secondly, those who reacted negatively or hesitantly, characterizing the IPS as kind of a or rather transpositioning the Euro-Atlantic Cold War model of some kind of adversarial contestation in economic and security domains, of course accompanied by the inevitable arms race into the Asia-Pacific region. In this light, the IPS was claimed to be an kind of a euphemism designed to contain China's, one country's sovereign right to achieve its economic and strategic success, exploiting naturally its competitive and comparative advantages. They were also concerned about the analytical constructs suggesting a trend, inevitability of conflict between existing powers, rising powers, and so forth, the so-called Thucydides traps and all that. So, while China, Russia, and DPRK, North Korea, with varying nuances, appear to be primarily associated with this group of negative reactions to IPS. Nonetheless, a number of countries in the global south who are looking to exploit China's economic and technological outreach found these postures resonating with them as well to some extent. Although these countries naturally did not have any tolerance towards the territorial or geopolitical misadventures of those very powers, including China, of course. Thirdly, are the countries that can be described, maybe for the want of a better word, as having mixed feelings about the IPS impact on security, stability, and prosperity, and also on the right to self-determination of regional countries. Now, while these states accept and even promote the sanctity of the IPS goals like open, free, the rules-based Indo-Pacific, where freedom of navigation is assured and other freedoms within and between states prevail, they have hesitated to buy all those positives and negatives ideology about it, claimed by the two contender groups above. And they happen to represent actually the large majority and the large potential of the emerging markets and production capacities, especially the ASEAN and many developing economies, including Sri Lanka, straddling east and west Asia. Although IPS's major players continue to reiterate what is known as the ASEAN centrality to the IPS success, ASEAN too continues to express concern and even reservations about the adversarial drift in the IPS wake and the dangers of militarization, nuclear proliferation concerns in a region where actually 10 ASEAN countries have declared a nuclear weapon-free zone. So there are also concerns, as I referred to earlier, whose rules one is talking about here. Are they consensual rules or are they contested rules? I think that is what Ambassador Shankar meant in the largest measure was adverting to. So are they consensual rules or are they contested rules? Consensual rules like the Charter, like the Law of the Sea and other multilateral treaties, or contested rules like nuclear doctrines of deterrence, balance of power, sanction policies, which are only a part of a disputed containment strategy. Last but not least, in these groupings, hope you have a few minutes, Mr. Last but not the least, in this complex and kind of a tangled web of various interrelationships vis-a-vis IPS, India brings to the table a unique set of credentials and corresponding nuances in its approach to IPS. As, of course, the largest democracy and only one that is enjoying a consistently robust growth rate of about 7%, and having acquired indigenously developed nuclear deterrent and space capability, India, with its well advanced strategic partnerships with the US, obviously has a significant interest in IPS goals and would certainly like to advance the agency it has in there. Um, and to do so, it consistent with a nuanced and qualified approach. This is because a significant China relevance of the IPS as a counterbalance to what China is as aggressive power projections of China, a country with which, of course, India shares a long and a very tense border. India also has its own strategic initiatives, Saga, Look East, Neighborhood First, etc. And to cap it all, it has a very impressive inventory of very complex defense, technology, military partnerships with both the advocates of the IPS as well as its opponents, like Russia. So the supporters, opponents. So India has these binary, interesting binary. India, of course, emphasizes that its strategic partnership with the US is not a military alignment against any country, including China. And Indian Foreign Minister is very eloquent in saying that India does not see global issues in a Euro-Atlantic lens, and that it is dictated by India's strategic autonomy and national interest. It's not clear whether India opted out of this nuclear submarine agreement or India was not invited, but it is clear that the pragmatism of staying out of AUKUS, leaving open space for working with China, wherever and whenever interests converge on issues ranging from climate change to business matters to conflict prevention, is a very complex, nuanced approach of India. So I want to conclude by making a brief remark, Mr. Chairman, on the possible implications of security doctrines associated with the IPS alliances and partisan. Some of the Australian research points out that order the IPS talks about is increasingly based not only on rules, but on policies like deterrence. And rather than multilaterally agreed rules. So a rules-based order within states and a deterrence-based order between states in the IPS may not constitute a sustainable binary, actually, in a space like Indo-Pacific, which is still evolving, like our president was alluding to a while ago. Even definitions are not yet clearly established. So, in fact, the kind of deterrent-based order the IPS advocates will likely enhance the utility of nuclear weapons in national security strategies of states like the DPRK, for example, further retarding prospects, if any at all, of denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula. So, what is even more concerning is that it could reignite agitations in countries like the Republic of Korea and even Taiwan, in East Asia, and even countries like Turkey and Saudi Arabia, West Asia, that they should acquire their own nuclear deterrent. So a number of respected think tanks have flagged this issue. So, to conclude, the evolving situation in the Indo-Pacific has some complex contrast. It is quite evident. It is also quite clear that IPS touches important centers of wealth and power, offering promise for cooperation to many emerging markets and developing countries in the region. The region has achieved phenomenal growth and wealth creation, and yet it faces formidable challenges of sustainability and wealth distribution. Also, a visible abundance of prosperity is confronted by paucity of security. Flashpoints and choke points remain. Many countries, Sri Lanka included, don't want to be clustered onto a wrong side of any power rivalry because they obviously want to benefit from all sides in order to ensure the well-being of their people. Now, here is the central point. Such countries are encouraged by the growing body of opinion that conflict is not inevitable, actually, and that peaceful coexistence is both desirable. Yeah, I'm finishing. The finishing mutually beneficial common ground exists for this. The region is large enough and its material and human resources potent enough for all big players to engage in reasonable rule-based play. As long as what we talk about are consensual rules and not contested rules. Any new strategies for deterrence, containment, de-risking, without decoupling, etc., hopefully enhance, not diminish this space for this pragmatism. So your discussions like these are well placed to contribute to this positive process of common ground building. Thank you. I'm sorry if I had...
Thank you, Ambassador Palihakara, for those valuable thoughts and suggestions. We next move to our second panelist, who is joining us online. He is Dr. Liu Zhongji, who is a senior fellow and director of the Center for South Asian Studies at the Shanghai Institute for International Studies. His research interests mainly focus on India's economy and foreign policy, China's foreign policy, BRICS, G20, among others. He worked previously with the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., the Indian National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, and the Institute of Strategic Studies of Islamabad, Pakistan, as a visiting fellow. Dr. Liu, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Firstly, I would like to thank the Pathfinder Foundation for inviting me to participate in this important conference. But I found maybe I'm the only guest speaker who have not been accepted to participate in the conference in Sri Lanka. So next time, I would like to express my strong willing to participate in the conference in Sri Lanka. Even you cannot find me, I can find myself. As for Indo-Pacific strategy and its implications on the Indian Ocean community, I have several points. Firstly, I think the so-called Indo-Pacific strategy is a destroyer of regional stability and prosperity. The so-called Indo-Pacific strategy is a measure taken by the United States to maintain its global hegemony, mainly targeting China. Since the Trump administration adopted the Indo-Pacific strategy, it has formed cliques, formed military alliances, formed exclusive economic and trade groups, cracked down on dissidents, and intervened in the internal affairs of other countries, forcing regional states to take sides. This has seriously affected the regional political situation and strategic stability. And to a certain extent, it has a destructive effect on the global supply chain, disrupting normal economic and trade cooperation in the region. the US and its alliances and partners use measures of information and public opinion warfare to disrupt people's cognition. But over the past few years, the people of most countries in the region have come to a clear understanding of the dangers of the Indo-Pacific strategy, which is not a major contribution to the stability and prosperity of the whole of the Indo-Pacific region as the Quad states advertised, but rather a destroyer of regional stability and prosperity. We can find that the United States now support Philippines and Taiwan Authority to wage conflict confrontation with China, with mainland China. And we can see that United States support Israel to crack down Palestinian people. That is the root reason of the Red Sea crisis. And also the US Indo-Pacific strategy has stimulated strategic opportunism of a few states in the Asia-Pacific and the Indian Ocean region with regional hegemonic ambitions. Some of them are attempting to contain China while promoting the transfer of regional industrial and supply chain to their own countries, thereby achieving their own economic takeoff and the rise as great power. These states are not only willing to serve as a lacquer of the United States, but also have their hidden ambitions, wanting to become spokesperson for the whole region and even the entire global south. We can see that these few states have been particularly active in the past 2 or 3 years, believing that their strategic opportunity period has arrived. So their foreign policy statements and diplomatic behaviors have become increasingly rampant. But their foreign policies have also sparked increasing opposition and protests in the region. My second point is that the Indo-Pacific strategy is not aimed at meeting the needs of most countries in the region. Indian Ocean is an important part in American Indo-Pacific strategy. However, the design of the Indo-Pacific strategy of the United States and other Quad states is not intended to serve most countries in the region. Since its implementation, the Indo-Pacific strategy has seriously disrupted the economic and social development of the region. The United States and its electors do not truly understand or care about the needs of most states in the region. So what's the reality and the real needs of the local states in the Indian Ocean region? Firstly, overall, the Indian Ocean region is rich in resources and has a large population, but its economic and social development is relatively backward. Some countries have serious problems with their economic structure, and their economies often fall into cyclical turbulence. For example, in the past 2 years, due to the interest rate increase of the Federal Reserve and the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, many economies in the Indian Ocean region have been facing crises, and many states lack experience and capacity in economic and social governance. Secondly, the regional countries themselves lack funds, technology, capacity, and know-how to support the development of their economy. One of the reasons that China initiated BRI is that South Asia and the Indian Ocean countries lack of sufficient funds to develop their infrastructure. Third, regional countries face many security and non-traditional security issues, such as piracy, coastal erosion, ocean pollution, climate change, and so on. For smaller states, island states such as Maldives, rising sea level is a fatal threat to them. Fourth, in terms of economic development, there is a lack of coordination among regional states. There is no economic core in the South Asia and the Indian Ocean region, but its economic complementarity with South Asia and the Indian Ocean region is not strong, with intra-regional trade accounting for only about 7% of the total trade volume of the countries in the region. And even serious interest conflicts exist between India and other regional states. India cannot provide sufficient public goods, such as funding, for the development of the regional economy. The regional power not only lacks the capability to promote the development of the Indian Ocean economy, but also wanted to exclude beyond the regional countries from participating in the economic and social development of the region in order to achieve geopolitical dominance. There are many regional cooperation organizations in the region, but they cannot solve these problems. Many regional cooperative mechanisms have significant exclusivity and geopolitical implications. So my humble observation is that the development of the economy in the Indian Ocean region requires the injection of external resources beyond the region, not only funding, but also technology and knowledge, governance experience, and even governance architecture at any stage, whether within the region or outside the region, has not the right to stop the urgent demand for economic and social development from the vast number of developing countries in the region. I would like to ask the representatives of the United States and the West, before China launched the BRI, how much have you contributed to the economic and social development of the country in the region in the past decades? How many resources have been invested from your states? And my third point is that Indo-Pacific strategy attempts to undermine the BRI. China's BRI has promoted the development of the economy in the Indian Ocean region, especially in the fields of infrastructure construction, trade, and investment. Not only China invested a lot of money in this region, but China's BRI has stimulated the investment of the United States, Japan, European countries, and India in the region, and promoted the development of the local connectivity and economy. The catfish effect of China's BRI is very obvious. I think this is one of the goals that China pursues, because China alone does not have so much capital to promote the development of this region. I really hope that the United States, Japan, and other Western countries can fulfill their commitments of heading the BRI for the region. In the past several decades, these countries have never truly cared about the economic development in the Indian Ocean region, I think. But in the recent years, with the implementation of Indo-Pacific strategy, the geopolitical dimension of the cooperation mechanism in the Indian Ocean region has been strengthened. As a leading power, as a so-called net security provider in the region, India is actively introducing the involvement of Western countries. India is cooperating with the United States and Japan to destroy the advancement of BRI and exclude China's influence in the Indian Ocean region. I think geopolitical competition is a severest challenge and threat to the regional economic development. So lastly, how to promote peace and stability and development in the Indian Ocean region. The Indian Ocean is an international common, except for the inland waters and exclusive economic zones of coastal countries in the Indian Ocean. The Indian Ocean is the most important global energy and trade sea lanes. And as the global economic gravity shifts towards the Asia-Pacific region, the importance of the Indian Ocean sea routes will further increase. And the seabed resources and other resources in the high seas of the Indian Ocean belong to all humanity. And the Indian Ocean economy is a part of the global economy, and the rise and the fall of the Indian Ocean economy will have an impact on the global economy. Whether from a geopolitical or geoeconomic perspective, the Indian Ocean is not exclusive to the Indian Ocean literary states, let alone to a particular Indian Ocean state. Of course, the Indian Ocean has a closer interest relationship with neighboring countries, and the responsibility of neighboring countries is also greater. This requires close cooperation among the coastal countries of the Indian Ocean, as well as close cooperation between the coastal countries closely related to the Indian Ocean. So firstly, I think regional peace and stability are prerequisites for the development and cooperation of the economy. No states in the Indian Ocean region want to take sides. Indian Ocean countries should unite to reject geopolitical competition and instead focus on geo-economic cooperation. Regional peace and stability mainly depends on regional countries. And secondly, Indian Ocean coastal countries should unite to establish an open, inclusive, equal, and democratic regional security architecture and reject exclusive military groups such as Quad and AUKUS. The AUKUS is very dangerous, just as the ambassador said, it has some nuclear problem. And the third is that I think the cooperation in the Indian Ocean region can start from non-traditional security and non-sensitive fields. Lastly, I think China, as a scholar from China, as a long-time observer of China's foreign policy and diplomacy, I think China will continue to promote cooperation with countries in the Indian Ocean region from the perspective of promoting economic and social development. China and the 19 Indian Ocean countries once held a conference on the theme of shared development, theory, and practice from the perspective of the blue economy. I think China will also provide funds and knowledge to the Indian Ocean countries through the Silk Road Fund, ARIB, and BRICS New Development Bank. I stop here. Thank you. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Dr. Liu, for those very interesting comments and observations. We now go on to the final stage for an open discussion. Now the floor is open for questions, observations. We would be thankful if you would identify yourself and if you represent an institution to mention this as well. I'm sorry, the third panelist, Professor Alden, could not join us because of some technical issues. The floor is open, please. Well, in case there are no questions. Yes, please, go ahead.
Is it okay? Good afternoon, everybody. I am Lieutenant General Reddy from Synergia Foundation, Bangalore, India. My question is to Ambassador G.S. Palihekar. I hope I have pronounced somewhere near. Ambassador, you spoke of particularly littoral states like Sri Lanka desiring to maintain an equilibrium between the power rivalry nations like US, China, and I would add even India to that basket. It's easier said than done to maintain an equilibrium between these nations in the power rivalry for these littoral states, because ultimately littoral states have got an agenda of development, including economic development, and in that context, unless they align and join one nation or the other, they would be deprived of those benefits they would accrue. Otherwise, if they maintain equidistance, probably they would be devoid of all the benefits that would be accrued to them by aligning to one or the other. So my question is, how does Sri Lanka visualize this strategy of maintaining equilibrium as well as catering to the developmental agenda of the nation? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, that's a multi-million-dollar question. But frankly, that lies at the core of the problems. I don't want to call them problems. The challenges that countries like Sri Lanka have. The challenge is, if we are to maximize our strategic location value as a country bordering east-west main shipping route, then we need to stay out of power rivalries, shunning power rivalries, so that we don't want to be seen as having strategic partnerships with contenders for power in the region. But our dealings with other countries are economic dealings, business dealings, not strategic partnerships. Because like I think Singaporean foreign minister put this very eloquently. He said, I think at a recent Next Step Global Conference in Singapore, I believe, he said that we don't want to be accused of being on the wrong side of a power rivalry, because we want to benefit from all sides. So that is whether our relationship with India and China, or for that matter, any countries, any developing countries' relationship with countries who believe on balance of power, they try to stay clear of the military strategic alliances, but they have commercial alliances. So that is the difficult task that Sri Lanka is also trying to navigate. Whilst we want to have investments from China, we don't want that investment to be seen as a strategic, with a strategic or a military footprint, so that our neighbors don't get unnecessarily excited that Sri Lanka can become either an unsinkable aircraft carrier or even a sinkable one. So we don't want that. So we want to confine our relations with the other power brokers, if I may use that one terminology, since I am no longer a diplomat. So we want them to be commercial relationship, commercial dealings, not strategic dealings. So to me, that is equilibrium, not in the sense of technical meaning of equilibrium, but a balance in which our interests are served and we don't give any cause for concern to anybody. Because even if we do all our dealings in good faith, it may appear to be security or military related to the other party. Because security is a perception, not an objective math calculation. So even if we do the right thing in good faith, it may appear to be a loaded thing, like whether it is Hambantota Port or Colombo Port or Trincomalee. So we don't want to parcel out our sovereign assets to various strategic players and try to balance it, because it is not possible to do it. And also you lose your sovereign autonomy when you try to do it. So that is what I meant by that word, maybe a clumsy way of trying to explain. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, the gentleman on the other side.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Chair. Thank you all speakers for your introduction in this panel. I'm Qin Ligong from China Embassy in Sri Lanka. Because some speaker mentioned South China Sea issue and freedom of navigation in South China Sea, so I would like to make some comments here. The crux of South China Sea is the territorial sovereignty disputes. Although such disputes exist between China and other coastal countries, the overall situation in South China Sea maintains stable. The freedom of navigation in South China Sea has never been a problem. And the issuance fee of merchant ships transit through South China Sea never rise. South China Sea is the lifeline of maritime trade of China, so we do not allow any obstacles in the freedom and security of navigation. We never ask foreign military vessels permission before they enter China's EEZ. Of course, EEZ is different from territorial waters. China always respects the navigation rights that come with the international law. However, we firmly reject any country's provocation and threat against China's sovereignty and security in the name of freedom. The U.S. military vessels, including the military survey or surveillance vessels, hovering in EEZ of China every day. So because we are staying in Sri Lanka, so next I want to talk about this country, not just China or US. I like this country. I'm new here just for a few months. China and Sri Lanka enjoys a long-standing friendship, and Sri Lanka common people is very friendly to China. So I think Sri Lanka is the best place to work in South Asian countries, although I've never been to other South Asian countries. Sri Lanka is a maritime country with limited mineral resources and technological capabilities. Harnessing ocean resources is crucial for its development. However, Sri Lanka lags behind in the historical development and utilization of its maritime potential. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea grants coastal nations the right to develop and ocean resources. leverage the rights provided by the Convention to develop its oceans and boost economic growth. Countries have engaged in maritime cooperation with Sri Lanka. The benefits have been in recent years. China and Sri Lanka have collaborated on joint scientific research and maritime cooperation. China provides technique build our own capacity to participate in the maritime research. We think strengthening scientific research capabilities requires collaboration with other countries. And based on current capabilities and intentions, China is an important partner. Amid escalating geopolitical competition among major powers, Sri Lanka faces significant pressure. We think the best approach for Sri Lanka is to firmly uphold national sovereignty and independence, pursue a balanced foreign policy, refrain from taking sides, and maintain positive cooperative relations with all countries, including China. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other questions or observations from around the table? Yes, please, go ahead.
My
Can you kindly identify yourself and the
I'm
institution?
Gamini Kirwella from Bandaranaike Center for International Studies.
Thank you. Go ahead, please.
My comment relates to Lieutenant General the Reddy and Professor the Ambassador Paliyakkare's comment. Right now, Sri Lanka, from Sri Lanka's point of view, Sri Lanka is in the midst of new strategic quagmire. Now, China is increasingly entered into the Indian Ocean with a strategic plan. It is very clear. At the same time, India is also asserting and extending its strategic parameters to the Indian Ocean. All these two developments are critically important to Sri Lanka because that affects Sri Lanka's interest. In this situation, what should be the Sri Lanka's the position? For that, we have to take into consideration Sri Lanka's geopolitical and geostrategic location in South Asia. We can't ignore that factor. Then one of the key issues is how to deal with India because of the strategic concerns and strategic factors as well as our historical experiences. At the same time, China is emerging, and Chinese the strategy is also a concern for Sri Lanka. In this situation, what would be our policy in order to promote our national interest? For that, as the Ambassador Paliyakkara correctly presented the stated, the non-alignment or equilibrium is not just the sending one part of the strategic point to one country, the China, and another one to India. That would not really equilibrium. We need to have real policy. That was the policy that we are following is not really equilibrium or balance. What we need is to go back to our real traditional foreign policy of non-alignment and neutrality. That is the way out for our the future. From the point of view of sovereignty and independence of the sovereign state of Sri Lanka. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador Palekar. I think the question of the directive.
Actually, I can be very brief. I totally agree with what Professor Gamini Kirawal had said.
Thank you. Yes, please. We have time for one.
Just to piggyback right a bit on Professor Kirawala's question and what has come around the table. Sorry, I'm Ravinath Arya Singh, ED, Executive Director from the Lakshmi Kadagam Institute. You see, what is very clear is that, and I speak from a Sri Lankan perspective, that there are various expectations from the major powers in the region as to what they would like Sri Lanka to do. We've heard that in this room today. We have also had Sri Lanka over the years taking different perspectives. Sometimes I have called it, on occasion, pendulum swinging as well, which may have caused concern to any one of those powers. But to expect that Sri Lanka can pick one over another was a stretch in the past, is a stretch today, and will be a stretch in the future as well. Ambassador Palekar, as he said, we wouldn't want to be without help at a time we would need. So therefore, and our country needs the US for certain things, it needs India for other things, and it needs China for other things. They have been with us at times. They have had difficulties at times. Now my question is not what we want, because I think notwithstanding the sometimes confusing rhetoric, even when Sri Lanka has been equidistanced, the problem we have faced is that Sri Lanka has been forced and very often into a zero-sum type of situation. And I think this, how today the challenge Sri Lanka really faces is, even if Sri Lanka is to adopt a policy, as Ambassador Palekar rightly said, is not going to parcel out assets to different countries, but to protect security concerns of the major northern neighbor, but be free to do its economic thing with other countries. The absence of respect for neutrality. Neutrality is only so good as long as people respect it. So I think it is important that all interlocutors with Sri Lanka understand that challenge we face and help Sri Lanka, which is trying to stay out of this quagmire or situation, to navigate itself without putting too much pressure on the country to take sides. Because if the pressure is to take sides, the answer will displease somebody. And I think that is not a position which countries would like to be. So I think Sri Lanka has been mature in the past and is capable of being mature in managing these dilemmas. And Sri Lanka should be given more space to navigate this terrain, which I'm sure we could do in a sensible way.
Thank you. We have one more question from Dr. Liu, who's joining us online. Yes, Dr. Liu, go ahead.
I have no question. I just have one comment to the question from Sri Lankan friends. My suggestion to our Sri Lankan friends is that you must keep good relations with India. I think Sri Lanka is an independent state, and you have your own independent foreign policy. But keep good relations with India is very important. And of course, we hope you have a balanced foreign policy towards all the powers, not only towards China, India, but also towards the United States and some European countries. But the problem is that India is too near to Sri Lanka, and they have with China, we have tradition of non-interference, but India has so many measures to interfere with your domestic politics and influence your social stability. So I think you'd better to keep a very good relation with India. And I, my humble you can learn from Bangladesh. You can find that Prime Minister Hasina they adopted a balanced foreign policy towards almost all the big powers. They keep a very good relations with India and also keep a good relations with China. I think this foreign policy is accepted and welcomed by China. Thank you.
With that, we bring this session to a close. Pathfinder Foundation would like to thank all the distinguished participants, the presenter, Mr. Darak, the distinguished panelists for those wonderful ideas. One of the reasons that Pathfinder holds this type of event is to act, if I may use the term, devil's advocate in bringing these ideas to the fore, so that in the end there is better understanding among every protagonist concerned with the theme. Thank you very much. The session is now closed. We will now adjourn for lunch before returning back for session 2. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Lunch is served on the atrium again, and the session 2 will begin at 2:45 p.m.
Oh, thank you, sir. I'm not convinced of all of them, but I thought it was a good forum to try to test some.